This is phase 2 in our pattern match project. In this demonstration, we'll be using straight scribing. Pattern matching does just what it says. We match the pattern at the seam of 2 pieces of flooring so that the seam virtually disappears. You may have to slide one piece of material back and forth to get the pattern to match from piece to piece, and an allowance must be made for this adjustment. How you compute this allowance is covered in a separate videotape. Our first step in this lesson is to split the second 6-foot piece, giving us 2 pieces approximately 3 feet by 6 feet. Place a straight edge just beside the mortar line in the center of the sheet. Cut so you leave the mortar line on the trademark side of the sheet. Use the S92 knife to score the piece first. Then finish the cut with the notch blade knife. Now you have 2 pieces of flooring with nearly identical edges. A mortar line and some excess material remains. The next step is to straight edge the factory edge of the piece of flooring we've already installed. Before you start cutting, be sure to protect the underlayment directly beneath the seam you're working on with a piece of scrap. We're cutting the mortar line along the edge to a slightly smaller width than the mortar lines in the pattern field. Later, this edge will be seamed to another piece of flooring. Cutting within the mortar line ensures that both edges of the seam will be the same thickness. If we cut in an embossed area on one edge and in a stone area on the other edge, the different thicknesses will create a ledge that picks up dirt. Hold the knife vertically, with no bevel or slant to the blade, and cut from both ends. We're ready now to fit this second piece of flooring by straight scribing. Use the same approach as the 3-wall scribe that you practiced earlier, with one exception. Previously, we didn't have to be too careful in scribing the main wall. But in this procedure, the main wall scribe is critical, and care must be taken. When this second piece of flooring is fit, it must overlap the first piece by the exact amount that we'll trim off when we make the seam. We call this an equal overlap. First, slide the material into the main wall so you can gauge the actual overlap. Here it's something over 2 inches. To make our job a bit easier, we'll increase the overlap to a full 3 inches, or the next highest hole measurement. Measure off 3 inches at each end of the straight edge section and make a mark. Align the section with the factory edge flush on those marks and line up the pattern lines. At the seam, we want the 2 partial mortar lines to make one full line. We need to trim 3/16 of an inch from the mortar line at the edge of this second piece when we cut the seam. Mark this exact spot on the rule. Now that leaves 2 13/16 inches that we'll trim from along the main wall. That's going to be the scribe setting you'll use, 2 13/16 inches. Be sure that the flooring hasn't moved off its overlap reference marks. Then place the end of your rule against the back wall and make a mark 2 13/16 inches from the wall. Loosen the pen vise on the scribing bar and set the pen on that mark. Push the point of the bar into the wall. Tighten the pin vise, and the bar now is set for the amount you need to scribe from the main wall, 2 13/16 inches. Now check again to be sure that the factory edge is on the overlap lines and proceed to scribe the main wall. Since the ends are flashed up the side walls, it will be difficult to scribe completely into the corners with the scribing bar. When the material is pulled away from the main wall for cutting, use a square to extend the scribe lines into those corners. After it's scribed, you can cut the material on the score lines and place it back against the main wall with the flooring pattern aligned. The second piece of material should now overlap the first by only 3/16 of an inch. Draw a reference line along the factory edge so you can tell if the material moves out of alignment. A piece of tape will help you see that reference line. Make a similar line near the other end of the sheet. Place another piece of tape and run a line across the seam on both pieces of material. Then cut it. When the pieces fit and in place at the main wall, the two halves of this line should match up. Now scribe the door trim. Slide the material away from the door trim, align the factory edge with the reference lines, and then extend offset pencil lines for both the trim and casing. Set the scribing bar to a distance about 3/4 of an inch short of the separation between these two halves of the line for a rough scribe. Now scribe the door trim and the wall. Cut out the material on the score lines and place it back against the door trim. Be sure the factory edge is still on the reference lines. Set the dividers for the exact distance between the two halves of the line and scribe the door trim and wall with the dividers. Cut the material along the score lines and put the flooring in place. The material should fit to the door trim, and the cross line in the center should be aligned and straight. Now scribe the opposite end. This is a straight wall, and we could use a strip measure, but for practice, we'll stick to the scribing bar. Slide the material back and set the bar for the exact measurement for the opening between the lines. We don't need to rough scribe since it's a straight wall, so go ahead with the final scribe. Then cut out the material. The flooring should fit the door casing, the main wall, and the end wall. The pattern should match, and the seam should overlap exactly as we measured it. We won't cut the seam just yet. That's still ahead in a later segment. But you have plenty of things to practice now, so stop the tape and work your way through this part of the pattern match project. We've covered pattern scribing and we've practiced pattern matching by straight scribing. Now we're ready to demonstrate how they work together in a procedure that ensures that the pattern scribe on one piece of flooring will line up with the pattern on a piece of flooring that's already been installed. In this segment, we'll use the remaining half of the 6-foot piece of flooring we split previously. You'll also need a piece of scribing felt that's 6 feet long. Normally, the first step would be to straight edge the piece of material already installed. We did straight edge this piece in the previous demonstration, however, so we can slip ahead. Cut the 6-foot piece of felt into the area with the edge butted to the straight edge of the piece already in place. Lock the felt into the room with triangular cutouts and tape. To transfer the pattern of the first piece onto the felt, we'll use a square. Lift the long mortar lines onto the felt by tracing both sides of the mortar line. As we mentioned in the last segment, we have to work with an overlap, a small amount of excess material that we'll cut off later when we actually scribe and cut the seam. To help get a proper overlap, we'll use reference lines called key marks. Lay a rule along the edge of piece number 1 and cut the felt along the rule with a utility knife. Do this in 2 places. Finish scribing the room using a square, a straight edge, and the dividers. Mark the divider setting you use on the felt. Take the pattern out of the room and place it over the flooring material you've already laid out in a larger area. Cut out the area on the felt that represents the mortar lines. Now this will help when you position the felt over the flooring. Line up the cutouts with the pattern on the material. To create the overlap at the seam, tear out the key mark, align one edge of the rule with the inside of the key mark, then move the rule and the felt to bring the outer edge of the rule just inside the mortar line in the material. That's where you will cut the seam. And by using these key marks to align the felt on the material, this piece will exactly match the piece that's already been installed. Lock the felt onto the flooring with tape . and scribe the material. Cut along the score lines. And take the flooring into the area where you'll be installing it. The material should fit to the walls and other objects, and it should overlap the proper amount at the seam. Check the fit, but don't cut that seam just yet. Stop the tape now and practice this step. Seam cutting is one of the most important aspects of flooring installation. Now, while it's relatively easy to repair miscuts you make while fitting most materials, it's almost impossible to repair a miscut on a seam. Once it's flawed, you can't recreate a well-cut seam. Materials with a pattern match should be installed as they come from the roll, trademarked edge to a blank edge. Materials without a pattern match should be installed by turning every other piece, or trademarked edge to a trademarked edge, or blank edge to blank edge. We're going to be discussing two ways of cutting seams, the double cut seam and the recess or underscribe seam. A third type of seam, the straight edged and butt seam, will be covered in a later segment when we demonstrate the Interflex installation system. Double cut seams are generally used when installing rotovinyl because two thicknesses of this material can be cut in one pass of the knife. Now, we've already installed the first piece of rotovinyl and we'll place the second trademarked edge to non-trademarked edge. Now, we've used weight to hold the material down. The best way to hold the first piece in place is with adhesive, but don't spread the adhesive any closer to the seam than 18 inches. The seam must be free of adhesive when it's cut. The second piece of flooring is overlapped on the first at the factory edge. The overlap must be exact so the patterns will match. On an actual job, the second piece would now be cemented to within 18 inches of the seam. You should place a piece of scrap 2 or 3 inches wide under the seam when you cut for two reasons. First, the scrap will protect the point of the knife when you cut through the two thicknesses. And second, the extra thickness will give the seam a slight fullness, which will compensate for something that will happen later. When the two edges are pulled back for application of the adhesive, the face of the material will be compressed. It'll shrink slightly, and without the little bit of fullness the scrap is adding now, the seam wouldn't close tightly. Now, after this piece of scrap is in place, lay a straight edge where you want to cut the seam, and then cut through both pieces with one motion. Hold the knife straight up and down. Now, the excess material should be on the same side as the hand you cut with. Remove the cushion of scrap from under the seam and apply the adhesive. Now, press the edges into the adhesive and hand roll. Once both sides are firmly seated, roll the complete floor with a 100-pound roller. Clean the seam with a wet cloth and allow the material to dry. Many rotovinyl floors require a seam sealer. Fill the applicator bottle Check the sealer's flow on a scrap piece of material. Set one of the applicator fins between the edges of the seam. Holding the bottle at a 45-degree angle, squeeze some of the sealer onto the surface. The fin will direct the sealer in between the edges. Allow the sealer 30 minutes to dry before walking on it. When you're working with heavier materials, recess scribing is a simpler way of cutting seams than double cutting. Set the recess scriber so the pin in the top bar is directly over the back of the knob. Now follow the straight edge with this bottom knob, and the pin on the top will trace a parallel line on the overlapping piece of flooring. Since accurate setting is so important in this procedure, you will want to preset the scriber using a scrap of the material you're installing. Cut a slit in the scrap. Slip the bottom bar into the slit and pull it tightly against the cut. The pin on the top bar should be directly over the cut. Now this is close to a perfect set, but a minor adjustment may be needed. We're using material without a pattern here, so put two like edges together, trademark to trademark or blank to blank. You should also make sure the material doesn't move as you work. Use something to hold the flooring secure. First, prepare the edge of the first piece of material. Factory edges may be damaged and you need a clean-cut edge to work with. Hold a knife perpendicular to a metal straight edge and make a clean cut. Now, you can also do this with the S33 edge trimmer. Simply place the material in this slot and draw the tool towards you, keeping it flat on the floor. The trimmer will easily and neatly cut off a 1/2 inch strip, leaving an edge that's just right for recess scribing. After this edge is prepared, the second piece of material is overlapped about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Set the recess scriber between the two pieces of material and draw the knob on the bottom bar against the straight edge of the bottom piece. As you draw the scriber towards you, it will trace a parallel line on the top piece. Scribe about 6 inches, then stop and test cut to check the tightness of the seam. If the seam is too tight, move the pin on the scriber away from the knob. If it's too loose, move the pin towards the knob. Now scribe the remainder of the seam. Apply even pressure as you draw the scriber along the straight edge. And be sure that the score mark on the top piece of material is deep enough to follow when you cut. Begin cutting from the end where you started scribing. Place a piece of scrap face down beneath the seam to protect the underlayment and the knife point and to give you a cleaner cut. Hold the knife straight up and down and cut with the scrap on the same side as your cutting hand. The knife must pull straight, so it's extremely important for the blade to be properly sharpened. If the knife pulls to one side, it won't follow the score mark. When the blade pulls to the right, use your stone to take a little off the right side. When it pulls to the left, take a little off that side. Don't try to cut all the way through in one pull. Cut lightly at first to deepen the score mark. Then increase the pressure with each pass until you cut through. Keep moving the piece of scrap to keep up with your cutting. Now let's check the cut. The seam edges should just touch. You don't want a seam that's overly tight, and of course, you don't want a gap. After hand rolling, run your finger over the seam. Now, you'll feel the burr left by the recess scriber. If it's not removed, this burr will collect dirt and the seam will look as if it's still open. On many materials, the burr can be removed by skiving with the back of the S92 knife. Later, we'll discuss other ways to remove the burr from different materials. Finally, the completed seam should be wiped clean of any adhesive and rolled with a 100-pound roller. Now, stop the tape and practice double cutting and recess scribing seams. After practicing, you can cut the seams on the flooring you've installed in your unit. The proper application of adhesive is critical to the success of a flooring installation. Now, please read the sections on adhesives and applicators in the Installation Recommendations booklet and the section titled Adhesive Application in the Installation Manual. We recommend this trowel for spreading adhesives under resilient tile and sheet goods. It's the S891 trowel, and the notches on this side, which is used for sheet goods adhesives, are 1/16 inch wide, 1/16 inch deep, and spaced 3/32 inch apart. The other side is used for tile adhesives. The notches are 1/16 inch wide, 1/32 inch deep, and 5/64 inch apart. We also have other spreaders. Be sure you have the proper spreader for the adhesive you are using. Now notice that there's a dating code on this bucket. With this code, you can pinpoint exactly when each batch of adhesive was manufactured. The first letter identifies the batch. The first number is the year. The next two numbers are the month, and two after that indicate the day. And the last number is the shift during which the adhesive was produced. Batch P, August the 11th, 1984, second shift. We'll use some scrap material laid face down to demonstrate spreading the adhesive. Pour some out in the corner. Not too much, not too little. After some experience, you'll know how to pour out just enough, and that will greatly increase your productivity. Now start spreading by cutting in the adhesive from the outside edges of your material. Normally, you would spread right up to the walls, but today, we'll stay back from those edges so we don't mess up the surrounding floor. Here are a couple of suggestions. Always pour the adhesive from the side of the bucket away from the label. That way, the next installer can read the instructions. And keep a water bucket handy for your trowel. You won't want to set it on nice new flooring. Hold the trowel on a 45-degree angle, swinging it at an arc as you draw the adhesive towards you. There's spring in that blade, so put it to work. Exert enough pressure for the trowel to pick up any adhesive that collects in small puddles where the floor is uneven. Now, once you've spread a small section, pick up the excess adhesive. Now, lay a piece of flooring into the adhesive and roll it with a 100-pound roller. Pull the material up, and you'll see the effect of that heavy roller. The notch marks are flattened out, and the adhesive is uniformly dispersed. Stop the tape now and practice spreading adhesive on some scrap material. Interflex is a resilient flooring installation system in which the material is bonded only at the seams and around the perimeter of the room. Now, the system works because the material is always rolled face out. Now, this imparts a slight stretch or tension to the material, and when it's installed, this tension makes the floor contract. Since it's fastened all around the perimeter of the room, the material tightens across the room much like a stretched carpet. Remember, you always have to roll an Interflex floor face out, never face in. Interflex seams are worked first, if at all possible, and are always cemented in place before the perimeter. The seams are straight-edged and butted together, which makes seaming and pattern matching a snap. Now, you'll be cementing the Interflex project in a training unit, so you'll have to cut in a piece of scrap material for an underlayment. And before you start, you should thoroughly sweep out the unit. We want two factory edges to work with for a seam, so we'll split the material in the center with a notch blade knife. Take one piece into the room and straight edge it so the pattern will be matched from this piece to the other across the seam. After the first piece is straight edged, position it and make safety cuts so it lays flat. The safety cuts for both inside and outside corners are exactly like you learned earlier in the knifing exercises. Now we'll leave the extra material along the straight walls and get it later with the wall trimmer. So you can make the seam first. Cut in a 6-inch or 8-inch section at the wall near the seam. Then straight edge the second piece. Move the piece in position, bring the seam together, and match the pattern in the center of the room. Now check for any pattern runoff. If the pattern does run off as it gets further from the center of the room, notice which piece is running long. Now make safety cuts in the second piece. And cut in 6 or 8 inches along the wall at the seam. Then roll back one piece and mark the seam line on the underlayment. The proper seam adhesive in installations over an existing resilient floor is S665, and that's what we're using here, applied in a 3-inch band along the pencil line beneath the seam. Place the piece of material with the long pattern runoff on the pencil line in the adhesive. Now, starting in the middle of the room, place the second piece, checking the pattern match. In most cases, you can stretch the material to compensate for any pattern runoff, but some Interflex materials can't be stretched and must be compressed, so check the recommendations booklet carefully. If small gaps appear at the seam, simply bind them together with masking tape. Be sure to use only regular masking tape. Other tapes can cause problems. Duct tape, for example, leaves a sticky residue that picks up dirt. Roll the seam with a hand roller to make sure the flooring has firm contact with the adhesive. After the seam is completed, fit the rest of the room. Since the safety cuts were made earlier, all that remains are the final cuts to walls and other objects. A carpenter's square can be a big help here. Push one arm of the square into the juncture of the wall and floor and simply cut along the edge of the square with a utility knife. The flooring that we're using here lends itself nicely to freehand knifing. Other Interflex floors may need to be scribed or pattern scribed. And you can use the wall trimmer. To start, make a trim cut in each corner. Push the trimmer along the wall, just as we showed you earlier when we demonstrated freehand knifing. The material will trim neatly to the wall. Use the carpenter's square as a guide for the short walls. And of course, you should trim any door trims and other irregular objects with freehand knifing. After the material is cut completely into the room, you're ready to bond the flooring to the subfloor. If the subfloor is concrete, you must use adhesive. Over wooden subfloors, however, you can use staples or a combination of adhesive and staples. Now first we'll apply the adhesive. Pull the edge of the flooring back from the wall and spread a 3-inch band of adhesive on all the areas to be cemented. Now stop when you get to within 8 or 10 inches of a corner so you can pull the material back at the next wall. Spread the rest of the seam at the wall and use adhesive at any doorways, even if a sill will be installed later. Continue all the way around the room until the entire perimeter is locked in. With any Interflex installation, it's critical to avoid spreading too much adhesive. Now be sure to review the recommendations booklet to familiarize yourself with the proper adhesives and their applications. Once all the areas to be bonded are spread with adhesive, put down the flooring and hand roll thoroughly. Now we'll staple the rest of the room. Now we're using an Armstrong S630 staple gun. Place the staples 3 inches apart or less and close enough to the wall so they can be covered by wooden molding or wall base. Now the Interflex material will contract, and as it does, the flooring will tighten itself across the room. As we mentioned earlier, some Interflex flooring requires sealed seams. Insert the applicator fin into the seam, draw the bottle along it, and deposit a small bead of sealer on the surface. The fin will spread the sealer into the seam, and the edges will bond. Keep traffic off the seam for at least half an hour while it sets up. Now you've learned the Interflex installation system. Stop the tape, assemble your materials, tools, and accessories, and practice what you've just seen.